лаборатории обучающих систем Массачусетского технологического института на доклад «Неспособность к изменениям. Почему только с помощью технологий нельзя изменить
Why
образование».
technology cannot change education? Justin, the floor is yours.
Thank you all so much for being here on a Monday afternoon. I have to apologize for my hat. Like many people, our lives are disrupted by COVID. I'm speaking to you from my garage, which is the only quiet place where my kids will leave me alone, but it's quite cold out here as winter is coming in Vermont, where I live right now. And so you'll just have to apologize for my piece of branding here. But I'm really grateful to have a chance to share some research with you. If you want to learn more about the book, you can go to failuretodisrupt.com. And then if this conversation is really interesting to you, you can also sign up for a book club that we're having where every week we're talking about one chapter of the book per week with a series of experts at failuretodisrupt.com/virtual book club. This afternoon, late in your night, unfortunately, we're going to be speaking with Courtney Bell, who used to work for Educational Testing Services and is an expert on assessment. I'm a former high school history teacher. I founded a consultancy called EdTech Teacher, which works with schools and districts to leverage technology to create student-centered, inquiry-based learning environments. When massive open online courses got started in 2012 and 2013, I was the first researcher hired by Harvard to study that phenomenon. And so I've spent a considerable part of my career trying to think about education technology and its opportunities and its limits. And one of the striking things, certainly in the United States over the last 10 years is and 20 years, is the incredible optimism that education technology evangelists have brought to the discussion of learning technologies. So there was a book in 2009 written by the late Harvard Business School professor Clay Christensen called Disrupting Class. And he said that by 2019, by last year, half of all grades 6 through 12 courses, half of all secondary school courses would be taught online, and they would cost a third as much to provision, and they'd have better learning outcomes. In the rise of MOOCs, in a kind of mania around MOOCs in 2013, the founder of the company Udacity, Sebastian Thrun, said that in 50 years, there would only be 10 institutions of higher education left, 10 places that were making and offering courses, and everyone in the world would flock to one of these 10 mega universities. We have a social entrepreneur in the United States named Sal Khan, who created a website called Khan Academy that makes available thousands of videos, mostly about math education. And he gave a TED Talk called Let's Use Video to Reinvent Education. And he had this vision where every young person would sit in front of a computer and they would learn math at their own personalized, algorithmically optimized pace. And so every student would sit in front of a computer and sort of learn math on their own trajectory. And then teachers would sort of periodically help by bringing students together to do projects for enrichment or to do kind of special remediation. But ultimately, everyone could learn math at their own pace. And then there was a researcher from the UK named Sugata Mitra, who said that we don't even need any of this school stuff, that really all you need to do is give young people laptops and a connection to the internet, and they can just teach themselves anything with almost no guidance and support at all. So these are dramatic claims about how new technologies could transform teaching and learning. And then over the past year, a pandemic has blighted the world. Over 1.6 billion learners have gone home. Their schools have been partially or fully shuttered. There's been a huge shift to remote learning. And what's become of all of those predictions? I certainly have no expertise in what's happening in Russia, but my guess is that your experience is not so different from that of the rest of the world, that many people without internet connection are shut out entirely from remote learning, and that those who do have an internet connection have in many places found it ranging somewhere from disappointing to disastrous. It's worked okay for older learners, for more affluent learners, for more proficient learners, and it's been really a disaster for younger learners, for less well-prepared learners. But even where it's worked, there has not been the widespread adoption of massive open online courses. There has not been the widespread adoption of algorithmically guided adaptive tutors or intelligent tutors. There has not been a turn to artificial intelligence or virtual reality or cutting edge new technologies. Instead, in many, and you could tell me if something is different in Moscow or Russia, but with the people that I've talked to around the world, there are basically two technologies that have defined the majority of our collective response to school closures. And they're two of our very oldest education technologies. So the two things that we've primarily turned to are learning management systems. And learning management systems are things like Canvas or Google Classroom or Schoology. There's a dozen more of these. Moodle is one. And they're basically tools that allow teachers to pass documents back and forth with students. They do a variety of other things, but they basically, remove some friction in the process of passing electric documents back and forth. You hand out a worksheet, you collect a worksheet. You assign a paper or a problem set, they turn the paper or the problem set back in. And then the second technology that we've primarily used when it was introduced in the 1930s was called video telephony. And we now call video conferencing. That's what we're using right now, which provides a kind of simulacra of the experience of people talking to one another. But of course, for all of you who have taught using Zoom, it's definitely not the same as being in the same place with people. If I was sitting with you there right now, I could look at your faces, I could see what you're understanding, if I'm talking too fast, if we're making a connection. And here there's sort of a handful of boxes that I can glance at, but it's not the same as us being together. But I would say this combination of technologies, what it primarily lets teachers do is, as closely as possible, replicate the kinds of teaching that we were doing before the pandemic. It's almost as if, especially in higher education and in secondary schools, that university researchers walked away from their lecterns and they sat down in front of their home office webcams and they tried to keep teaching exactly the way as we have done before. Now remember, the EdTech entrepreneurs, the EdTech evangelists promised us a transformation. They promised us a radically different vision of schooling in a moment in which education was stable. And here we are in a moment where education systems are hobbled, where education systems can't operate the way they want to. And we have not, generally speaking, turned to new technologies. We have not turned to reinvented education systems. We've turned to what feels most familiar and most comfortable to us. And that is absolutely in keeping with at least 30 years of research on education technology. Overwhelmingly, people teach how they were taught. and they use new technologies to extend existing practices. Despite this, there's, in my mind, remarkable conversation about how the pandemic might profoundly change education. In the last, 6 months, I've been on half a dozen international panels with names like reimagining education, or the dawn of the online era, or reimagining education, variations on that theme. And those titles are striking to me because we're living through one of the most conservative periods in education history. I don't think in our lifetimes we will ever get a more powerful demonstration of the conservatism of educational systems than what we've seen during the last year, during the pandemic, where instead of reimagining what might be possible, overwhelmingly, we've tried to recreate what we had before. So I think there are two main themes that we can draw from.
Две ключевые темы,
to two themes which I find constant in the education technology literature. When teachers get access to new technologies, they use them to extend existing practices. And when there is beneficial, innovative new practice with education technology, it does not democratize education. It does not spread the fruits of its benefits most widely. It tends to disproportionately benefit the affluent. It tends to disproportionately benefit those with the financial, the social, the technical capital to take advantage of new innovations. Some of the folks who over the last 2 decades have been evangelists for education technology have started to reframe and rethink their original claims. Many millions of people have watched Sal Khan's TED Talk. Many fewer people read an interview that he gave to District Administrator magazine. So District Administrator is a very small trade magazine in the United States. It's mostly read by school superintendents, school principals, people who lead municipal education systems. Me and maybe 4 other people read this interview with Sal Khan. And in the United States, Sal Khan is known as one of the leading advocates for transformation through online learning. And in this interview, he says, now that I run a school, one of the things about Sal Khan is, in addition to creating this online platform, Khan Academy, he created a school, a physical in-person school in California, in Silicon Valley, outside of San Francisco, called the Khan Lab Academy. It's a private school. Most of the students pay $20,000, $25,000 a year to go there. Mostly affluent students in the Bay Area. And he says, now that I run a school, I see that some of this stuff isn't as easy to accomplish compared to how it sounds theoretically. And he says, I think now the best way for most schools to use Khan Academy is to teach the way that they were teaching normally, about 4 days a week, and then 1 day a week do practice problems with Khan Academy. So here's someone who used to advocate for having each individual student entirely learn at their own individual algorithmically optimized pace, for a radical reconfiguration of American education systems. And now his argument is teach 80% the same you've done before, and 1 day a week use Khan Academy for practice problems. That's a big shift from a more ambitious to a more conservative perspective on education. It's also a model of using technology to teach math with a very long history. my colleague at Carnegie Mellon University, Ken Kadinger, had built this very model in the Pittsburgh public schools in the early 1990s. So nearly 30 years ago, Ken Kadinger brought adaptive tutors into schools. They tried to get teachers to teach normally 3 days a week and then to use the adaptive tutors 2 days a week, but teachers wouldn't do it. And the best they could get is kind of 4 days a week of regular instruction and 1 day a week of practice problems. And they got, sort of roughly the same kinds of findings as Sal Khan claimed to get 25, 30 years later. So one way that you could tell the story of Khan Academy is that with, maybe $150 million of philanthropic investment, they learned a lesson that you could have learned by walking to your local university library and doing some research on the history of adaptive tutors. There's much that we've learned about education technology over the past 30 years, and there's little that has emerged in the last few years that completely overturns our previous findings. Like lots of things in education, the story is one of consistency, of continuity, more than one of change. One of the ways that I try to talk about this in Failure to Disrupt is to offer two stances for thinking about education technology, two kind of frames of mind or approaches that we can bring as researchers, as school leaders, as instructional technology staff. And I borrow these terms from a great book by Morgan Ames called The Charisma Machine, which is about the one laptop per child initiative that came out of the MIT Media Lab. And Morgan comes up with these two stances that I borrow. And one stance is the charismatic stance. This is the stance that believes that technology disrupts and transforms existing education systems, that the future is getting ready to be a break with the past because of these new and different technologies that are available, that we are at the cusp of some kind of great change, like we've seen great changes in journalism, in retail, in government, in politics, in dating, in relationships. But a second stance, and Sal Khan in 2011 illustrates the first, and Sal Khan in 2019 illustrates the second. The second stance we might call the tinkering stance. And the tinkering stance says that technology doesn't disrupt educational systems. Instead, educational systems domesticate new technologies. They take new technologies and they draw them in, and they find places for them in particular niches, in particular slots in our education system. That the powerful transformative force is not the new technology, it's the existing education system. So if you want to understand the future, you should think of the future as an extension of trends from history. When you're trying to guess what's going to happen with the future of education technology, you should guess small iterative changes. And in fact, what I try to argue in the book is that we should celebrate small iterative changes. Education systems are immensely complicated. Our schools, they teach young people to tie their shoes. They teach older people to solve calculus equations. They teach people how to understand plate tectonics, how to throw a baseball, how to speak Mandarin. They teach people from all walks of life, in all kinds of circumstances, and we don't agree on what they should do. In the United States, we have powerful debates over whether the purpose of schools is to teach students to be patriotic citizens or to teach students to question and critique their country. there's no single way of doing all of these things that we ask schools to do. So it becomes this incredibly complex network and ecosystem, and you can't sweep big parts of it away and replace it with technology. At best, if you want to make these systems better, it's not about doing one big thing. It's about getting 100 or 1,000 different things right and a little bit better each day. Our technologies for learning, they aren't bulldozers that sweep away the past. They're specific tools that work in particular subjects for particular students in particular contexts. And we can definitely make them better. And through making learning technologies better, we can make our educational systems better, but not in a transformative way, in a iterative, consistent, shoulder to the wheel kind of way. I'm sure there's some appropriate Russian idiom that I don't know for that kind of slow laboring work that I hope my translator will choose an appropriate idiom to share here. So that's those are the two stances that I think we face. And I'll tell you, I wrote the copy edits of this book in March of 2020, right as the pandemic was about to strike. And it's a nerve-wracking time for many reasons to submit a new book, because looking at the page proofs, I thought to myself, what if the next 3 months proves everything that I've said wrong? What if there are dramatic changes that are afoot? But I tell you, in the book, I argued that education systems are conservative, they're consistent, and they improve through tinkering and through iteration. And I think the pandemic has really borne that out. All the time in the United States, people ask me, which school system, which district do you think has really figured out remote learning and really done the best job? And as far as I can tell, there is no answer to that question. There's no city I could point you to. There's no university I could point you to where I could say, look at this. They've really got this figured out. And it makes sense because there hasn't been enough time for us to figure this out. School systems get better slowly. And so we should celebrate the work of those tinkerers who are working month after month, year after year to try to make things better. Okay, let me tell you about, well, I'll say this part in conclusion to that bit. I've said a couple times, our technologies are not all purpose. They're distinct pegs that work in a vast landscape of differently shaped holes. They're good in this subject, but not that subject. For this group, but not that group. They work a little bit. And I think the other huge mistake that we've seen people make during the pandemic is believing that learning technologies are a switch that you can flip on and off. They're not. Learning technologies, you don't just download them and then they work, and then people all of a sudden start learning. Our learning technologies are only as effective as the supports that are provided to the communities that use them. It takes time to learn to use new technologies. It takes time for teachers, for university faculty, for educators, for communities to adapt and evolve. In the United States, I think we're seeing this. I think if you went and asked teachers in many, many places now how remote learning is working during the pandemic, they would say, it's working better than it was working in March. It's working better than it was working last semester. It's still not as good as regular school, but there's some improvement. And we should celebrate the teachers, the professors, the lecturers who are doing that learning and doing that improving, but it's not a straightforward task. Let me give you a preview of what I try to do in the rest of the book. And then we can have a conversation and take some questions. So in the first half of the book, I try to argue that if you think that the future is an extension of history, then if you want to be someone who's well equipped to use new technologies to help students as a teacher, as an administrator, then you have to know something about that history. New technologies are very rarely new. New technologies are slight improvements on things that we've already built in the past. So I argue that there are three genres of learning technologies, three kinds of learning technologies that we make. And the way to distinguish them is to ask the question, who chose the sequence of learning activities? And there are technologies where an instructor chooses the sequence, puts together a set of linear options for a learner. And those are instructor-guided learning at scale. Things like massive open online courses from edX or Coursera fit in that category. There are things where an algorithm decides the sequence of learning activities, where a computer system evaluates student work, figures out whether the student is ready for harder work or needs remediation, and then an algorithm suggests what the next learning activity should be. That's algorithm-guided learning at scale. These are things like adaptive tutors, intelligent tutors, Khan Academy, the Duolingo language learning app, things like that. And then there are learning environments where groups of peers come together, and together they create a network of learning experiences. Almost everyone in the networked world is a member of one of these communities. If you go to the internet to learn to do your makeup in a new way, or to make a new cocktail, or to cook a new meal, or to beat a level in a video game, you are probably a member of one of these peer learning networks. But the original connectivist MOOCs were like this. The Scratch programming language is a good example of this. Anyway, the important thing is that we know something about all three of these genres. What we know is hard to summarize, but we can take a crack at it. We know that for instructor-guided learning at scale, it tends to work best for people who are already educated and already affluent. If you're a good learner, you're likely to do well with independent, self-guided learning. If you're not already a good learner, these courses are hard for people. We know something about algorithm-guided learning at scale. It only works in domains where we have good assessments for that domain, which isn't very many domains. They work well in math. They don't work very well in reading. They work well in computer programming. They work very poorly for evaluating writing and reasoning from evidence. We don't have algorithms that can distinguish a good argument from a bad argument. And the number one thing we do in our education system is to teach people to reason from evidence, to make arguments. So there's this huge technological hole right in the middle of our education system, which limits what algorithm-guided learning at scale can do. That doesn't take away from what it can do. I think there are millions of young people around the world who can't get into a math classroom safely with a human teacher, and so they're using online adaptive math tutors. That's great, but it's a small portion of what we've lost from the pandemic. It's a little peg in a particular hole. It's not a sweeping transformation of our system. And then lots of people informally really enjoy learning from peer-guided learning at scale, and very few people find themselves successfully using these tools to earn course credit to advance their academic learning. these peer networks don't mesh well with the institutions of school that really put an emphasis on individual learning and individual performance and create barriers for collaborative and group learning. So if you see a new technology, a venture capitalist, an education technology evangelist, a developer will tell you that it's brand new. They will tell you they've created something that's never been seen before, that's better than anything that's come before. And now you can look at them confidently and say, that's not true. The new things that people build are modest incremental improvements over things that have come before. And if we learn something about what's come before, if we learn about the research behind these tools, then we can say, no, that's a new algorithm guided learning at scale. And we know those sometimes help in some subjects modestly, and there's lots of places where they don't work. And then you can look at this new thing and decide where it fits. That's the main discipline for evaluating and using new technologies that I hope educators will take up, to think, how is this like what's come before? And how is what's come before worked or not worked? All right, let me skip ahead a bit to the second part of this. Now, if you're someone who does research or development into education technology, I would say that across these three genres, across instructor guided, algorithm guided, peer guided learning at scale, the same challenges and obstacles come up over and over again. There are a set of problems, a set of dilemmas that limit the power and usefulness of education technology. And if we want to tinker effectively, if we want to iterate, put our shoulder to the wheel, we need to figure out how we're going to address these four problems. Let me discuss each of them briefly, and then we can take questions and discuss whatever you like for the top of the hour. And the four dilemmas have to do with sort of three features of schools. As I've said before, schools are enormously complex. What we ask our school systems to do, from kindergarten through graduate school, in every subject, in every discipline of human ingenuity, it's very complicated. Our technologies are very uneven. They work well in some areas, but not others, for some students, but not others. And particularly in the United States, but I imagine this is true in lots of places in the world, our systems of schooling are very inequitable. In the United States, there are cities right now that can turn to remote learning and trust that almost all of their students are affluent, almost all of their students are connected to the internet, almost all of their students have computers. And there are other places in the United States where many, many students are living in poverty, they're living in broadband deserts in cities, or they're living in unconnected rural areas. They don't have access to new technologies. We have a very inequitable system of education in the United States, and that is a central feature of our system, and it's a crucial consideration for understanding learning technologies. So what are these four dilemmas? I'll mention them briefly, and then we can discuss. One is the curse of the familiar. And that is, if you want a technology to be widely adopted in schools, you should make something that does what's already happening in schools. In the United States, we have an app called Quizlet. And Quizlet lets you make digital flashcards. It's used by maybe half the high school students in the United States and by tens of millions of people around the world. But if we got education experts together and said, what are the biggest challenges that our schools face? None of us would say that there's a real dearth of flashcards. None of us would say that we don't have enough index cards or paper for students to be able to memorize things. This is a nice convenience, but it's familiar. It's adopted because it's recognizable, but because it only digitizes an existing practice, it doesn't lead to substantial improvements. By contrast, when we make technologies that are very new, that are very different, that allow for different ways of thinking about teaching and learning, new pedagogies, new curriculum, new relationships, educators and students find them confusing and have a hard time using them. If you make something that could potentially lead to really important breakthroughs in teaching and learning, it would confuse most people as they're trying to learn it. So something education technology designers need to figure out is, how do we build tools that start by feeling familiar, but then become more ambitious, more transformative as communities of educators and students learn to use them better? How do we have sort of welcoming foyers and then wide walls and high ceilings? A second dilemma I call the EdTech Matthew effect, from a line in the book of Matthew, which is basically, to he who has much, much will be given, and to he who has little, much will be taken away, that the rich get richer. Many education technology evangelists claim that new technologies will democratize education. But what we see over and over again is that it's really the most affluent people, the most well-supported learners, that are most capable of taking advantage of new technologies. So new technologies, rather than closing gaps, they tend to exacerbate inequality. We don't know very well how to change this dilemma. In the chapter in the book, I profile 5 or 6 organizations that I think are doing interesting, important work to try to be very thoughtful about this problem. One part of the solution of making more equitable education technology probably involves involving our most vulnerable students and the teachers who serve them in the education technology development process. If new technologies are built by wealthy people in Silicon Valley, and then they're used in urban schools that are very far away from those communities, socially, politically, racially, it's unlikely that elites are going to make something that work for schools that they've never been to, that they've never worked in. So we have to close that social distance. We need to not only measure how new technologies are used, but we need to measure how they benefit or don't benefit students from different subgroups. We need to figure out, we need to track how technologies are used by people from different racial groups, by people from different income levels, and start to figure out what are the features of technologies that democratize education rather than expand inequality. A third dilemma is the trap of routine assessment. Our assessment technologies are limited. Computers are good at assessing things that have routine, that have structure, where there's one exact right answer. Computers are good at assessing the kinds of things computers are already good at doing, but we don't need to teach people to do the kinds of things computers are good at doing. We need to teach people to do the kinds of things computers can't do, that you can't turn over to a robot or an algorithm or easily outsource. So we have these technology learning systems that are particularly good at preparing people for job functions that no longer exist. That's a dilemma that we need to be able to solve by improving the quality of our assessment technologies, and then also rethinking the role of assessment in our education systems. If we have education systems that are organized around large-scale computer-based examinations, then we're not going to be testing students on the skills that they most need to thrive in civil society or to thrive in the labor market. And then the fourth dilemma is the toxic power of data and experiment. We can make online technologies better by collecting lots and lots of data from users and by running experiments on them constantly. Every time you go to Amazon.com or your favorite shopping app, or maybe 1% of the times you go, you're being exposed to some small experiment. Do you buy more with a red buy button or a blue buy button? Do you buy more if we show you the prices this way or show you the prices this other way? And generally speaking, we think that's an okay deal, that I get to go to an online store and it sells me stuff and they collect data about me and run experiments. It's very different when we do that in schools, because around the world, young people are forced to go to school. And so collecting lots of data about them without their consent or understanding, it leads to a kind of surveillance state that across the world, more and more people are concerned with the quantity of data that governments collect indefinitely about their citizens. There's also a concern. I think it's a good idea when we do experiments in schools, but it turns out that lots of people don't like the idea of experimenting on school children. And so we need to figure out how we have, set up regulations, have public conversations that let us responsibly try to continue to iteratively improve these systems without having young people feeling like they're guinea pigs or without a massive infrastructure of data and surveillance. So those are four of the kinds of challenges that education technology designers, that policymakers, that venture capitalists will have to take on in the years ahead if we want to have a more robust, more powerful education technology. Solving these things won't lead to disruption, won't lead to transformation, but this is the kind of work that tinkerers with learning technology will need to do for our field to grow and to persist, and for online learning and digital learning to provide new tools that can benefit and sustain learning communities. And sort of underneath all of this is a recognition that learning technologies alone aren't what make education systems better. What makes education systems better is when communities of educators select learning technologies, learn about learning technologies, become more proficient with learning technologies, and then use them. And that's what leads to improvement and growth. One way that I say this is every technology solution is a human capital problem. Our systems of learning technology are only as powerful as the communities that use them. So with that, I will pause and thank you for your attention. I see lots of comments in the chat, albeit I can only read about a third of them. My fault, not yours, but I'll look forward to hearing and trying to answer some of your questions.
Джастин, спасибо огромное.
Justin, thank you very much for a very interesting and fruitful presentation. We have several remarks, and there are some separate conversations going on in the chat room. Some people are discussing it, and they're not even believing that these problems are happening now, especially the last one, because some of the people do not really have never thought that lessons can be experiments and kids can be guided through the experiments. But I myself do agree with the observation which you have, that every presentation is an experiment, especially under the condition when tutors also learn the technologies. So, well, we have several questions coming your way, and there's one. So, do you need any basic skills before, which are pre-required, which are prerequisites for the distant learning? Like, students got to have the basic skills, basic knowledge which is like 100% required for the distant learning?
Базовые знания.
So one of the things that we've observed, particularly over the last 10 years, particularly as we've sent tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students to start doing online learning, is that we see what's called an online penalty, that many students do better in a face-to-face learning condition than they do in an online learning condition. But in particular, students who are less well prepared, students who are lower income, students who are less well served by the education system, they experience a larger online penalty. In the United States, we see that, for instance, our racial minorities, Black students, Latino students, are less likely to do well in online learning. And in the pandemic, you can start to see why. White students are more likely to live in affluent households where they have better technology access, where they have parents who are more likely to be able to work from home, where they have more people familiar with the education system. So I would say the important thing is the way that we typically design online learning now is particularly well suited to already educated, already affluent students. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are other ways we could build new technologies. There's one field, for instance, where we've seen very little difference in some respects across people from different backgrounds, and that's in interest-driven learning. When young people study and learn online things that they really care about, people from all different backgrounds can be very successful. When people learn, when they get really excited to teach themselves to computer program or to write fan fiction, write stories about Harry Potter's universe and things like that. When they want to learn, engineering or makeup tutorials or other things, like when we learn the things that we're most passionate about, we actually see very little difference. Where the key difference seems to be around motivation and figuring out how do we support and scaffold motivation for all different kinds of students online. But I generally agree that if we are worried about a group of students, just in general, we should be particularly worried if we're asking them to learn online, because generally speaking, we find that it's our most proficient students who adapt well to online environments, and our least well-served students are often, served even less well when we teach them online.
Да, есть еще несколько вопросов, Джастин.
So there's another couple of questions which we're having. So, in your opinion, what may be the exact technologies which may provide the disruption in terms of involvement and motivation? Which may be the technologies which inspire people to learn more?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. They are, because it's not really so much about the technology, so much as it is about the system and about the curriculum. We could build a curriculum in schools that made more room for interest-driven learning. And we know that many students can be very successful in peer learning environments when they learn about things that they're excited about, where they learn how to, do sound mixing for making music or media production. There's, in some sense, nothing that would prevent us from going to our school curriculums and saying, let's do a little bit less of these required topics, and let's do more around student choice and student agency and student autonomy. But that's not a technology problem. that's a political problem. That's getting education policymakers to agree to reconsider what we want students to learn throughout their curriculum. I think most of the most substantial, there are definitely some things that we can improve with learning technologies. We've found it very, very difficult to get better at automated assessment, and we should keep working on that. But most of the ways that we're going to improve education is not going to be through technology breakthroughs. It's going to be through politics. It's going to be through policy making. It's going to be through, continually rethinking what kinds of institutions will best serve students as they prepare for their lives.
А вот интересный вопрос нам задали.
Here comes another interesting question. So is there a difference between distant online learning and the old school, old-fashioned homeschooling? Is there that big a difference?
I think it's a very good comparison. I would say the problem, the key difference with homeschooling is homeschooling assumes the full-time presence of an adult caregiver. Homeschooling assumes that there's going to be someone around to help students when they get stuck. But our education system, one of its main purposes is to provide care for students so their parents can go to work. In the United States, we depend upon schools to care for children during the day to make it possible for adults to be able to be in the workforce. And while online learning can provide some learning experiences, and I think in some cases for older students, it can be, older motivated students, it can be like homeschooling. But homeschooling systems, in the United States, we have, before the pandemic, existing virtual schools. And mostly what they did is they sent home curriculum in physical printed packets through computers for parents to teach their children. So that is kind of the crucial difference. Actually, in the United States, one of the things that I've been most disappointed about is that we haven't had an honest conversation with parents about what's going to be expected of them. Starting this summer, we kept talking about remote learning, digital learning, but we really should have been talking about coached homeschooling, because that in fact is what we've ended up doing during the pandemic. So in countries that have moved increasingly towards households where both parents work, school closures have really particularly been a disaster for families. In the United States, this is a great example of how education systems are connected to other parts of our lives. In the United States, we've started to call this recession a she session. Again, the translator will have to figure out how that translates, but she session in English is sort of a riff on like a female recession. Enormous numbers of women have left the workforce because they felt compelled to be home to take care of their children. And it's a real setback for women in the workplace, and it's a real disaster for families that have depended upon both parents being home. And again, there's no technology that will solve that problem. Politics will solve that problem. Providing more resources for childcare, providing more, making mechanisms so that women can temporarily leave the workplace and then come back. That's what'll solve these problems, not new education technologies. We need to be aware of the limits of what they can do.
Пару раз в чате спросили про
So a couple
анонимные.
of times we had questions within chats dedicated to the anonymous survey, both of kids, both of students. Oh, no, the question is the anonymous survey and evaluation of tutors and teachers carried out by students. What's your take on that? Is it a working system? What do you think of that?
Так, не прошел вопрос.
I'll start by saying that teachers should partner with students in making their classes better. Particularly during the pandemic, there is exactly one generation of students across the world that have learned during a global pandemic. And those are the people who are sitting in our classes right now. And we should listen to them. Now, we also know that the anonymous evaluation of teachers by their students often has bias behind it. Women are much more likely to be rated lower than men. Racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to be rated lower than people who are in the majority or the historically dominant group. And those can have real negative effects on people's careers. So we should certainly survey students. We should listen to them. We should partner with them in creating better schools. But we should also be careful in using these surveys and evaluations in teacher evaluation systems and faculty promotion systems because they can be quite biased and quite unfair. Like a lot of things in social science research, they sort of point sort of in the direction of truth, but it's like a noisy signal. And, you know, we still, as social scientists and as political creatures, are trying to figure out what to do with this kind of information, which tells us some things that are useful, but other things that are biased and wrong.
Джастин, я знаю, что вам нужно обязательно уйти в 5 часов.
We know that you have to run in a couple of minutes. Therefore, a very brief question. So like 2 minutes. So there are many commentaries in chat dedicated to the lively interaction, face-to-face interaction of students and teachers to teachers and teachers to students. But some people say that maybe artificial intelligence may at least be this peg which will help in this. So what's your take on, like, what would be the peg field by used as an artificial intelligence?
Yeah. I hope what you would take away from the whole talk is, I hope you can guess my answer, which is that artificial intelligence will help a little bit. We will be able to tinker with artificial intelligence to improve our systems. And Georgia Tech, they have some really neat experiments in discussion forums, having artificial intelligent agents that contribute to discussion forums. And they're good at answering questions like, when is the next assignment due? Or, you know, on what page will I find the answer to this problem? Really highly structured questions and answers they can give instant help with. That's good. I think for already fluent, already proficient learners, they might really benefit from interactions with artificially intelligent agents. I also think the vast majority of us, when we learn, need the presence of other people. We need other human beings to talk to write with, to interact with, to motivate us, to be in relationship with us. You know, one of the things that most struck me about the pandemic was that there exists millions, tens of millions of dollars worth of online courses that have already been built. If you were teaching introductory physics this spring when school got interrupted, one of the things you could have done is pointed your students to an MIT online physics class, to a Harvard online physics class, to many online physics classes, and said, look, these people spent millions of dollars building this courseware. It's going to be much better than what I can do during a pandemic. Just learn from them. And there was virtually no demand for that around the world. Overwhelmingly, what people wanted during the pandemic was their own physics teacher, their own teacher that they already had a connection with to be able to learn from. Even if that person was unprepared, even if that person had never taught online before. The human relationships are always going to be at the center of teaching and learning. And I'm sure there's ways that artificially intelligent agents will help communications, will answer simple questions, will be a useful part of future learning environments, but they're not going to replace the human relationships that are so central to teaching and learning. It's been wonderful to be able to spend my morning and this afternoon with you. I'm very grateful for all of your questions, and I'm so glad that you had your own conversation.
Спасибо огромное.
Chat.
Thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you very much.
It's been a wonderful pleasure. I hope you all stay very safe, and I look forward to staying in touch in the future. Thank you so much.
Супер. Спасибо огромное.
Thank you,
Очень...
bye.
До свидания. Давайте, коллеги, поблагодарим.
So, dear colleagues, let's thank Justin. Bye.
Кстати, мне понравилось, как переводчик нам помог в сегодняшней лекции. Я считаю, что, коллеги, нам надо и переводчика поблагодарить. Особенно мне понравилась оговорка «искусственный интеллигент». Вот. Я надеюсь, что это будет символом наших дальнейших вебинаров, поскольку действительно технологии должны поумнеть, иначе они будут создавать те проблемы, о которых сегодня говорил Джастин. Да, но мы надеемся на вашу дальнейшую поддержку. У нас еще будут иностранные спикеры. До свидания, да. Коллеги, всем спасибо. Тогда встречаемся на следующем вебинаре. Следите за нашей рассылкой. Мы еще хотели опрос, но, Настя, уже, наверное, все, да? Тебе не слышно, тем более.
Да, давайте я попробую запустить, может быть, кто еще остался.
Кто не ушел, да, может быть, ответите. Я прошу прощения, немножко.
Потратить секундочку для того, чтобы выбрать вариант ответа. Сейчас.
Это важно для нас. У меня просьба ответить. Какая из ловушек технологий, о которых рассказал профессор Райх, кажется вам самой негативно влияющей на обучение? Эффект Матфея так и переводим. Эффект Мэтью.
Он же действительно так и переводится.
Он действительно так переводится. Можно Мэтью называть. Я думаю, что сегодня, кстати говоря, были вопросы про то, насколько различным бывает уровень оснащенности между центром и периферией, но сегодня их почти не было после того, как Джастин привел примеры Индии, где с этим на порядок хуже, чем у нас в отдельных районах. Так, ну что, у нас результат такой. Ловушка привычной оценки. Это, собственно, лидер среди ответов по негативно влияющим факторам. Спасибо, коллеги, еще раз. Надеюсь, вас всех увидеть в следующем нашем вебинаре. До новых встреч.